All right, hello again. Good afternoon and welcome to Cronkite Global Conversations in the first ever Cronkite Global Week at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. My name is Juan Mandel and I am the Director of Cronkite Global Initiatives, which fosters meaningful connections among Cronkite students, staff, and faculty, and international media professionals, scholars, and citizens. Cronkite Global Initiatives fulfills its mission by building bridges of understanding, mutual respect, and shared global engagement experiences, and the Humphrey program is one of these programs that we host through Cronkite Global Initiatives. Today, you will be hearing from all 14 of our current Hubbard H. Humphrey Fellows who represent 13 different countries and territories. This cohort of fellows are one of the 13 Humphrey Fellowship programs hosted at US universities in a wide variety of disciplines, but we are the only cohort that hosts the mass communication and journalism students. This Fulbright Exchange program is through the US State Department and our partner, the Institute of International Education Abroad. At ASU, we have hosted over 124 fellows from 64 countries and territories from across the globe. And now I would like to introduce Balin Favok from Hungary, Gaihok Lee from South Korea, Andrea Polanco from Belize, and Johnson Mayamba from Uganda. They will talk about migration and how each of our countries have a variety of experiences with people from other countries. Following the screening of our conversation, Andrea Polanco, Gaihok, Johnson will be joined by Brian Cervantes, a Masters of Global Management scholar at Thunderbird School of Global Management, for a moderated discussion, taking questions from the audience in person and online. Thank you for being here today.
Hi everyone, my name is Balin Favok from Hungary. I will speak about migration in Hungary with a special focus on one specific event, which had a huge impact on my country. So a few words about my country. Hungary is located in the middle of Europe, and the population of the country is almost 10 million people. The size of the country is around 1/3 of Arizona territory. So it's quite a small country, but we have a long history because the state was established in year 1000. So during the history, Hungary was mostly a multi-ethnic country. We get a lot of foreign influences from different cultures. We were occupied, for example, by the Turkish Empire for 150 years, and we also had a huge German impact on the country. For example, you can see this picture from 1910 when Hungary was much bigger, 3 times bigger than now, because after the First World War, we lost the 2/3 of our territories. So that time, the Hungarians were even in a minority in the country. Their proportion was around 48% based on that poll from that time. There were many Romanians, Germans, Slovakians, Croatians, and Serb people. And the real number was even smaller for the Hungarians because there was a significant Jewish minority, accounting around 1 million people. And in this poll, they were counted as Hungarians. So after the First World War, we lost most of our territories with the different ethnicities. And during the Second World War, the Hungarian state murdered most of its Jewish citizens. So after the Second World War, Hungary became a country with a homogeneous population. And during the communist times, which lasted until 1990, until the collapse of Soviet Union, Hungary was quite isolated. So we didn't have much migration in addition to university students from friendly countries. But after the system has changed and Hungary became a liberal democracy after 1999, the borders opened and a few numbers of migrants started to come to Hungary, especially Chinese. In the first time, 40,000 Chinese people migrated to Hungary in the first part of the 90s. So currently, there are around 200,000 foreign citizens in Hungary. So it's still only the 2% of the whole population. And they're mostly Ukrainians, Romanians, Chinese. And because of the Ukrainian war, there are around 300,000 Ukrainian refugees in the country. But of course, we don't know what's going to happen with them. Another important tendency was the rapid surge in issuing residential permits in the last couple of years. So the number of these permits have tripled since 2014. The reason of that is the labor shortage, and they mostly came from Asia and from Ukraine, and they worked in the manufacturing sector. So there is a poll from 2014. It's an old one, but it's not a coincidence that I picked this one. You will see why is that. And you can see that 40% of the respondents, they oppose any kind of migration, and only 10% were welcoming towards migration unconditionally. And there was around 50% who were like quite unsure. So they would control to somewhat level. And they were also asked, these 50%, about specific nations or ethnic groups. And as you can see in the chart, there was a small progress between 2007 and 14, because they were not as hostile against Arabic or Chinese people as 7 years earlier, but still the proportion was around 70–80%. And there is a name which you probably don't know, Parisian. It's they don't exist. It's a fictitious nation. They were set up in order to demonstrate by the researchers that how Hungarians are against generally, they are against migration. So let's speak about one case study, one specific example, the migrant crisis in 2015, which you probably heard about. So in 2015, around 1.3 million people migrated to Hungary, mostly because of the Syrian war. I mean, they went to Europe, but they wanted to go mostly to Western European countries, to more developed countries, to Germany and Sweden. But Hungary was on their way, so many of them crossed Hungary. And the government, the Hungarian government and the prime minister, in my view, saw a political tool in this phenomenon, and they started to conduct a huge and harsh campaign against migration during that time. And it was quite simple and not so welcoming and not so empathic towards this crisis. So they put billboards everywhere in the country, like literally, saying, for example, if you come to Hungary, don't take the jobs of Hungarians. Or one other stated that if you come to Hungary, you must respect our culture. So these messages were that simple. And this is also quite representative because they were like literally everywhere. This one said that the United Nations wants us to accept migrants on a continuous basis, but Hungary decides, not the UN. So the sophistication level of the messages were like in that level. And that was even simpler, like just stop. And that's all what we have to say about this. But actually, politically, it worked very well. And because of this, they just kept on going and going. Even though the crisis only lasted for a couple of months, this message went on in the propaganda, in the government-controlled media for years and years and years. So almost no migrants stayed in Hungary because everyone went to Germany and Sweden. There were like not a lot of migrants. You didn't see them on the street. Even in the remotest, very poor villages, the people were really afraid of migrants because they thought they would come here to their very poor, isolated village, and they would make explosions, they would rape women, they would take their jobs. And just one example, 3 years later, there was a parliamentary election in Hungary. And this screenshot is originated from the most read pro-government news portal. And as you can see, during the campaign of the election in 2018, there was no migrants in Hungary, like almost. All the news were about migrants from different countries. For example, there was a war between migrant gangs in Sweden. 4 migrants killed a Swedish woman. And my personal favorite is that unidentified migrants gathered around in a park in Brussels. One striking example is this one, when the second, third most influential Hungarian politician that time, János Lázár, went to a neighboring capital, Austria's capital, to Vienna. He went to a neighborhood which is inhabited mostly or partly by immigrants. And he wanted to introduced to Hungarians that how horrible is that when migrants live in a neighborhood. And among others, he said that if we let them in, the migrants, and let them live in our cities, then there will be crime, impoverishment, dirt, and impossible urban conditions. And it was a kind of odd because the GDP per capita in Austria is 3 times higher than in Hungary. Especially this guy is coming from one of the poorest areas in Hungary. And Vienna was elected as the most livable country in the whole world for many times in the last couple of years. And as you can see from the background, it doesn't seem like the most disorganized cityscape, you know, what you can imagine. So that's why it was a little bit surprised that he was speaking about impoverishment, dirt, and like impossible urban conditions. But actually, this campaign worked very well politically because the proportion of xenophiles, they went up significantly. And if you see the long trend, in the beginning of 90s, the proportion of xenophiles was around 15%. And after this campaign, it was close to 60%. And those people who would welcome migration unconditionally, they dropped literally to 0. So I have to also add that before this migrant crisis, the government was in a crisis, the government party, because there were some corruption scandals and internal fights. So you can see this chart that their popularity decreased rapidly. And the migrant crisis came, they started to use it, and they regained the support, and they almost doubled their support in the next 3 years, thanks to this phenomenon. And they won the 2018 election with a supermajority, and they are still in power. So that is what I wanted to speak about. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me in my email, which you can find at the Humphreys portal. And now I would pass the floor to Andrea Polanco from Belize. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Polanco. I'm from Belize. Where in the world is Belize? Belize is a small country that bears a dual identity of being both Central American and Caribbean. As you see on the map, we're bordered to the north by Mexico and west and south by Guatemala, and we have the Caribbean Sea to the east. My talk today is about how the movement of people have shaped the cultural tapestry of this small former British colony. Back in the 80s and 90s, Belize was a haven for refugees from neighboring countries. As you can see on the map on the right, the Central American map, we have the Northern Triangle, which are the countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And so Belize was a haven for refugees coming from these countries. There were thousands of people displaced as a result of political turmoil, civil wars, and organized crimes in those countries. And Belize was widely praised for welcoming about 30,000 of Spanish-speaking refugees, which represented a 10% increase in our population, which essentially changed our country's ethnic mix. Interestingly, Belize didn't establish refugee camps or otherwise restrict these refugees' movement. Instead, our government designated a special area called Valley of Peace, a settlement for Central American refugees that granted them access to land for farming. As a matter of fact, history shows that since 1983, Belize has received the highest number of foreign population in our region. Beyond that, even today, Belize remains reliant on immigrant workers for agricultural industries such as bananas and citrus from these neighboring countries. Importantly, this migrant population has made important contributions to the development of Belize. The 2015 statistics from the IOM shows that in Belize, immigrants account for more than 15% of our population today. And so now I wanted to speak just very briefly about the ethnicities in my country. As you can see in this pie chart, the Mestizo group accounts for half of our population, which are people who are mixed with Latin blood, or as often referred to as Hispanics in our region, as a result of absorbing these immigrants and refugees from neighboring countries. But we also have the Mayas, who are the first people of Belize. They are indigenous to our lands, and their presence can be traced back to about 500 or more years. We also have the Garifuna people, whose roots go back to Africa as descendants of slaves. But today I want to point out one of these groups, specifically the Mennonites. Because Belize is often referred to as the melting pot of cultures because of the wide variety of ethnicities that can be found in Belize. So just before we get into the Mennonites, just to give you a look at the faces that we can find in Belize, there you have the Garifuna, the Mayas, the Creoles, the Mestizos. We also have a very small percentage of Arabs. So these are the people, if you travel to Belize, if you visit our country, these are the people you'll see when you visit. This is a Mayan woman, again, a Mayan child. This is one of the Mennonite, a Mennonite family, another Mennonite family. And so today, as I get in to talk to you a little about Mennonites, so I want to point them out because they came to Belize more than 60 years ago. And so I want to share their story because of the great contributions that they've made in my country. And because oftentimes when we think of immigrants, the messaging around immigrants is often negative and bad, and it has caused division among countries, among people. No doubt, I believe that movement of people should be managed and it should be done in an orderly way so that all parties can benefit. But in order to capitalize on the economic and social benefits, there must be respect for immigrants. Today, the Mennonites represent 3.6% of our population. They have over 12 colonies in my country that spreads across, and their number tally to about 12,000 in Belize. As you're seeing on the screen, we have two photos. One's of a picture of women with babies. These are Mennonite women. And the other photo is of a Mennonite man on a horse-drawn buggy. That's how the very traditional Mennonites travel in my country. So they came to Belize as immigrants in the mid-1950s. And so before I get into their story, I want to share with you an account from one of the first settlers who came to Belize.
A lot of people wouldn't have come if they had known it was so difficult. I mean, it was the hardships that followed after we came. And it was a complete different setting, we had no idea what it was like to go directly into the jungle and try to make a living.
So these Mennonites in Belize are called Old Colony Mennonites. They descend from the settlers of Chortitsa, the earliest Mennonite colony in the Russian Empire. Their ancestors moved from the Netherlands and what is now Poland to present-day Ukraine in the 1780s and then to Canada.
Our parents were looking for freedom, religious freedom as well. We felt very welcomed by the government. They were willing to let us in.
So a group of over 3,000 Mennonites who moved from Canada to Mexico and eventually migrated to Belize, which was then called British Honduras. They were able to settle, followed an agreement with our Belizean government, which offered them land and religious freedom and exemption from certain taxes, and as committed pacifists from military service. In return, the country has enjoyed the fruits of their skills and knowledge and labor through agriculture. Today, Mennonites dominate Belize's domestic poultry and dairy markets, despite representing less than 4% of our population.
They were still importing a lot of chicken. There was nothing local, and then people started but didn't work. At that point, Nobody believed that Belize would ever become self-sufficient in chicken, right? It was going to be a group effort to spread chicken. So where that is interesting, not only did quality poultry create the poultry industry, it created a culture of chicken in Belize. I mean, there was this all started from scratch. The mentality in my head as we were growing up, we don't, this is something we do and we make sure we contribute and not take. That was the foundation from the beginning. Look, we were made here in Belize. This is our home. This is our country. This is everything we do.
But who are the Mennonites? Their roots go back to Europe. In their homes and work, they speak Plaudish, which is called a low form of German, although they also speak English, Spanish, and our native tongue called Creole. The Mennonites are divided into two groups, the conservatives and the progressives, which is essentially a distinction in their way of life and use of modern technology. But their history, their religion practices, their dress, their culture, their customs connect them all. Those in Belize are called the Old Colony Mennonites. They descend from the settlers of Chortitza, the earliest Mennonite colony in the Russian Empire. Their ancestors moved from the Netherlands and what is now Poland in the 1780s and to Canada in the 1870s, Mexico in the 1920s, and a few decades later to Belize. The Mennonites left Europe because they were being persecuted for practicing their religion, and being the pacifists that they are, they began to move to the Western Hemisphere, and those journeys took them to parts of South America, Canada, and Mexico. But in Mexico, when they were no longer guaranteed that their children wouldn't be drafted for the military, they began to look for greener pastures, and that took them to Belize. It was the right time for us to absorb them and welcome them as immigrants because we were a developing country at the time, still very much a British colony and dependent on the logging industry. But we also were in desperate need of large-scale agriculture because we were looking for sustainable sources of food as we were also thinking of becoming an independent nation. And so the Mennonites made a diplomatic visit in 1957, and there they met with our then leader, who would go on to become our first prime minister and forge that agreement that led to the development of their first settlement called Spanish Lookout in 1958. It is the biggest and most advanced of their colonies. Today, as I mentioned earlier, there are about 12,000 Mennonites across the country of Belize. And in their communities, they make most of the hardware, the grains, the dairy, the poultry, the vegetables, the wooden furniture, crafts for our country. In 2018, they celebrated 60 years of being in Belize. They have been stalwart cornerstone of our independence and stalwart cornerstone of the economic activity in my country. In fact, the Mennonites produce 85% of the poultry and dairy products currently in our country. They have helped Belize to develop a solid, sustainable agricultural industry that was key to our self-sufficiency. Their skills and agricultural prowess have established a culture of eating chicken in Belize, and it has become the primary source of protein, a staple in our diet. They have not only made poultry accessible and affordable to our country, but they've made it to become a part of our culture. And because food is a critical part of our identity, rice and beans with chicken being our national dish is something that we collectively share. And so today we get to enjoy an uninterrupted supply of chicken thanks to these immigrants who came to Belize more than 60 years ago. Today, we see them as our people, the Mennonite of Belize. But that's only possible because at the time our leaders saw the potential and promise of this group of immigrants. Our forward-thinking policy and approach facilitated the holistic integration of these people who came to our country. But displaced people face hardships everywhere, even if they're welcomed or not to another country. They've given up a lot, they've sacrificed, and oftentimes are just looking for a better way of life. So what can you do? What can we do? We can be better allies to immigrants, support the work that they do, buy their goods and services, become informed of their plight, become informed of who they are as people, speak up and speak out, use our privilege to help them. We can also champion policies that are inclusive and respectful of the rights of displaced people. And finally, what we can do is that we can support organizations that provide direct services to these immigrants and refugees. And that's the story, that's the Belizean story of the Mennonite people of Belize. And so now I pass it on to my colleague Gahyuk from South Korea.
Thank you, Andrea. My name is Ga-hyuk Lee from South Korea, and I'd like to talk about the current situation about the immigrants in my country. Fortunately, to be honest, it is a kind of contentious issue in South Korea. It is true that many people in Korea pride themselves on ethnic homogeneity, even as the population of 52 million is getting older rapidly and the labor force is diminishing. So immigrants are coming to South Korea because of the job seeking or marriage. According to the South Korean National Statistic Office, in 2020, there are 2.15 million immigrants in South Korea. It is about 4.1% of South Korea whole population So the portion of immigrants is not that big comparing to the other so-called developed country like Germany, who has 20.5%, and Canada, who has 21.9%, and Australia, who has 26%. This is why people in South Korea are not familiar with the immigrants and their issue and their current situation. And the government are also not fully prepared for immigrants and for establishing any other immigrants policy. So to be honest, the immigrant policy is not on the top priority for South Korean government. The number of immigrants in South Korea has been continuously increased till 2019 and 2020. The number was slightly declined. It's because of the COVID-19. And by country of origin, Chinese immigrants are outnumbering. In 2019, they are 1.1 million, and it is more than 40% of the whole immigrants in South Korea. And second is Vietnam, and third is Thailand. And irregular migrants are almost 0.4 billion in June 2020. It is about 17% of total immigrants in Korea. Mostly they came to Korea using tourist visa, and they have not returned to their country after the end of the legal length of stay. So this is article from the Korea Times written in 2019. So it says that nearly 15% of foreign staying in Korea are illegal aliens, with Thais taking up the largest ratio. And as you can see, almost half of them entered the country through visa waiver program and have not departed. So especially in 2018, the South Korea hold the Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games. So through this Olympic Games, the government expanded visa waiver program. So the number of such people has increased. Before I pass on this case study, I'd like to mention about the irregular migrants more. So the Koreans, sometimes terrible crimes which was committed by illegal migrants became the social issue. Then Koreans' antipathy toward illegal foreign workers is rising. When this kind of news continued, people had the negative image of immigrants. So Korean people think about them like they might be dangerous. So it causes some kind of xenophobia. So from some cases, we can see the divided views of Koreans towards immigrants. So last August, Korean Air Force recused nearly 400 Afghans from Kabul. That they are the people who have worked for the Korean government before the Taliban seized power, and their family members. So the evacuated Afghans were arrived August in last year in Seoul. So South Korean government amended the law to allow long-term stays for them. However, as you can see, the two different pictures, the public divided into pros and cons about them. So on the left picture, parents of an elementary school are holding a picket protest against the admission of the evacuated Afghan children at the school playground. And on the other hand, another photo shows members of civil society organizations supporting the Afghan settlement in their community, holding a welcoming press conference. And this survey showed a sad reality. So in 2019, National Human Rights Commission of Korea conducted a kind of depth interview with more than 300 immigrants regarding their discrimination experience in South Korea. So as you can see, more than half of them said, I heard verbal degradation, and more than 3 out of 10 said, I was discriminated against about promotions and salaries at work. And the last one, nearly 20% of people said, I was refused to enter the store at this current situation in my country. So it's sad, right? So the researcher commented that South Korean government should make a clear policy to prevent racism and discrimination to the immigrants or foreigners. And the last case study is about the unregistered child. The 동아일보, which is one of the biggest newspaper in South Korea, covered his story recently. His name is Jonathan. He is 6 years old, and he was born under Indonesian parents in South Korea, who are working in South Korea. So the parents are illegal immigrants whose visa to stay in South Korea has expired. So Jonathan is so-called unregistered child, because if a newborn baby wants to register as a Korean citizen, at least one of the parents must be Korean. So they have settled in South Korea and working in kind of factories, so-called 3D dirt, dangerous, kind of the very unfriendly working space. But so they have settled in the Suwon city, which is close to Seoul, the capital of Korea. But in Suwon city, there's no daycare center for Jonathan, for unregistered child. So Jonathan moved to Ansan city, another city, the highest proportion of foreigners in Korea, with 13%, and was only able to attend daycare centers. So this is because the Korean government limits the target of daycare, childcare support to those with Korean nationality. So Jonathan, when the pandemic season, he has to just stay in small house. There, he doesn't have any chance to go outside and go visit somewhere to be taken care of. So many experts in South Korea highlighted that embracing the immigrants is inevitable. So as you can see, the human rights lawyer said, we have to think about how to live well with migrants, not how to block and control migrants. And another professor insisted that the Korean government should refer to the Germany's case. So referring to the Germany's case, the policy of inclusion should be implemented. And another expert said that the South Korean government should re-establish policies to respond to changes in population composition and cultural diversity. So maybe we should keep an eye on, I should keep an eye on the situation and how to government deal with this problem. So this is all I have. 감사합니다. Thank you. And I'd like to introduce my fellow Johnson Mayamba from Uganda.
Thank you so much, my colleague Gayok, and also the previous speakers, Andrea and Balit. Much as my colleagues have spoken more about migration, I'm going to talk, my discussion is going to focus on refugees. Just for clarity, the migrants are those that move willingly, while refugees are forced to move from their own countries. But to start, before I delve into it, I would like to introduce my country. As we can see from the map of Africa, Uganda is a landlocked country that was formed as a result of great migration on the African continent. Majority of the Ugandan population was formed from different tribes that moved and settled in Uganda. To the east, we have Kenya, and then to the north, we have South Sudan. Before this shows full Sudan, but before it was divided into two countries. But yes, to the north, we are neighbored by South Sudan. In the east, in the west, we have a Democratic Republic of Congo. Southwest, we have Rwanda and Burundi. And then in the south, we have Tanzania. So we are a country that is in East Africa, surrounded by different other countries. Uganda was founded in 1894 as a British protectorate. We are a population of about 47 million people, and more than half of these are below 15 years, and 70%, more than 70% are below 35 years. This makes us the third youngest nation on earth after Niger and Mali, according to the latest statistics. We also gained our independence on 9th October 1962. This means that this year we are making 60 years as an independent country. When we look at the symbols, this is our flag and the national coat of arms. Just to briefly tell you about the flag, it has three colors of black, yellow, and red. Black signifies the black origin, the black skin. Yellow represents the good weather that is gifted to us through the sun. But then red represents brotherhood, sisterhood, Ubuntu, as it is normally talked about. And then when it comes to the national bird, this is the crested crane. At the time of when Uganda gained its independence, our people who were there then imagine that Uganda was a young country that was taking off to a new journey that is independent, that is secure for them, that would enable them live the way they wanted. So since then, Uganda has we still have the crested crane standing on one foot because we're a country that is still growing, a country that is still moving forward. If you can see, when you get to see most of our symbols or most of our institutions have the crested crane standing on one leg. Then to the right is the national coat of arms, still the crested crane on it, and also the core, but also other symbols that represent our agriculture, represent our tradition, represent our customs, represent our good weather, and the gift of natural water sources, our country. Much as we have for God and my country, Uganda still considers itself as a secular nation. We don't have a particular religion that we take as a nation. Moving on, what is the history of our hospitality as a nation in terms of hosting refugees? In 1940, Uganda hosted Polish refugees who were fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe. Those were like the very first that came to the country. In mid-1950s, Uganda also hosted 80,000 refugees who were fleeing the first civil war in the original Sudan. Between 1959 and 1964, almost half of Rwandans fled their country during the first civil war, and of them, about 100,000 came and still settled in Uganda. These were the first of the many waves of refugees that have over the years come and also eventually settled in Uganda. Why is this possible for them to come? This is because Uganda, being a nation that was formed as a result of migrants or people who are moving from other places settling, they understand the situation of other people who are seeking refuge, who are seeking new places where they can find peace. And as a result, we have an open door policy that has facilitated this kind of welcoming refugees over the years. We have been considered as the world's best place for refugees. That's according to the Guardian, but also the Washington Post have also rated us as one of the best countries that are good for refugees. Moving on, what is the percentage? What are the numbers in terms of refugees and compared to the population in the country? According to the statistics from UNDP, these refugees account 1.5 million, above that. And when you look at the statistics, further look at the statistics, the majority of these come from South Sudan, who account for 2/3 of refugees that we host as Uganda. Others come from Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Somalia, and other neighboring countries like Rwanda, and also some from Kenya. Why are they running away from their countries? It's because of the instability that happens in their countries, and that is caused especially by the civil wars like we are witnessing currently in the Democratic Republic of Congo and also in South Sudan. The refugees account for about 3% of the population. And as we look further, 60.8 are South Sudanese, almost 30% from Democratic Republic of Congo, 5% are from Burundi, I beg your pardon, and then 3.5 are Somalis. You know, also, when we look further, in just last year, Uganda accepted to the UN's request to host more than 2,000 refugees who are fleeing from Afghanistan. And as we speak, they are still arriving. But then what happens when these people come in our country? What is in the country for them that they can enjoy or benefit from? Uganda is one of the countries that has a policy that gives a right to refugees to enjoy the same social services as citizens, including healthcare and education. There are no limits to what they can access. There is freedom of movement. As we know that most countries, when they host refugees, they are confined, especially in camps. But yes, when these refugees come to Uganda, they have the option. Yes, there are camps, but also others have the option of moving freely to places where they feel they are comfortable to settle. So most of them have moved as far as coming to Kampala, which is the capital city, and have found their colleagues who have settled and formed what we call communities. We have a Sudanese community in Kampala, we have Somalis community, we have those that come from Congo with their own community. Like we host a number of refugees from different countries, but they have come, found a peaceful area to live, and in the end have formed communities around that can support themselves when there's need. We also have some of these refugees also have the right to buy land, own property, and also settle, like I've said. But additionally, these refugees have a variety of livelihoods that they can take advantage of and also live in a comfortable life. Those that come when they don't have any skill, they are enrolled into vocational skills, especially women, are enrolled into vocational skills so that they can have something they can start for themselves to sustain, to be self-sustaining in terms of living. This has not been a rosy road. There are also challenges that have come as a result of hosting the refugees in Uganda. Over the years, we've had issues of inadequate services coming up in terms of what government can offer to its nationals, but also other people that are coming in as refugees. You find that there are constraints when you get to the health centers, and also maybe when you get to the schools and other places, you find that there are limited resources that can accommodate the entire population, but also be able to provide for all the refugees that come into the country. We also have the high levels of unemployment. There is rampant unemployment, not only in the cities, but also when you go across the country, because when these refugees come, they also compete for the same job opportunities as those that are as Ugandan citizens. And yet, yes, there are no limits. If as long as you have the skills and you can do the job, why not get the job? So in terms of unemployment, there has been a sharp rise in Uganda. We have also witnessed issues of overburdened cities and strains on resources, especially in communities where these refugees live. Because once they come and settle or are given a home in host communities, these refugees also enjoy, like I've said, enjoy the same resources. They are given land, and some land is also cleared from the forest to create space for them, to create gardens for them, but also provide firewood for them. As a result of these different activities that have impact on the climate, we have seen increased effects of climate change in terms of Ugandan weather. We have also had challenges in terms of refugee humanitarian management, humanitarian aid management. There have been previous stories that have come up in terms of corruption from the offices that receive and manage these refugees in Uganda. So it's not yet solved. It's still a challenge that is still ongoing, but we hope in the near future, we can always find a lasting solution to those challenges. When you come to Uganda, the most language that you always interact with, whichever part of the country you go to, is Luganda, and in Uganda we say "webale" to mean thank you. So our audiences online and also in person, these are our presentation from the migration group. We welcome you to engage with us to discuss. If you have questions, we are more than ready to respond to them. Thank you so much.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Again, my name is Brian Cervantes. I'm a full-time student at Thunderbird School of Global Management, and it's a pleasure to be here. We're going to go ahead and open the Q&A session. We have a microphone here in the middle, and please, online students, anyone online, feel free to go ahead and ask questions. I wanted to open up here the discussion. Really interesting with Belize. They took the initiative of accepting the migration, and it was wanted to know more about those positive economic factors that Belize grew from having these people in the country. If you wanted to explain a little bit further on the migration.
Well, in my video, I spoke primarily of the Mennonite people of Belize. And at the beginning, you heard me talk a little about the Central American immigrants. These are people who are, they're immigrants and then they're refugees. So in the 80s and 90s, for example, we took in about 30,000 or so refugees, people who were running from just the political instability in the Northern Triangle countries, as the US referred to them, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And so as a result, in our country, we took in about 30,000 of them. They're primarily agricultural workers. And so they've established communities. For example, we have one community that's called Salvapan, because majority of the people who live there are from El Salvador. And these communities are farming communities. And so what they do is that they produce like the fruits and the vegetables that supply most of the country. I mentioned briefly in the video, we talk about Valley of Peace. That's primarily a refugee community that was set up where the government provided services such as education, healthcare, and other social services, because these are people who, were running from their countries because of the civil wars that they were experiencing. And so again, in that particular community, for example, they produce almost like 90 to 100% of cabbage in my country and different crops. So for example, about 2 years ago, as Belize, as a small, we're considered one of the small island developing countries. And so as a result of that, we're hard hit by the changes in climate. And so in Valley of Peace, for example, they had just massive floods, successive floods, and then they experienced just months of extreme drought. And as a result of that, our country, for example, we had to import things that we'd normally plant. But these are crops that are grown by these people who have come to my country seeking refuge. And so they've contributed a lot in terms of the agricultural aspect. For us, agriculture is perhaps like our second primary industry. And so they contribute a lot to our GDP.
Great, yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I'm gonna shift my attention here. It looks like we have our first question. Please go ahead.
My first question would be to Andrea. First of all, it's very interesting story about these people, Mennonites, right? We in Russia, we have the similar group. I believe you know that story about the Jehovah's Witnesses. They are followed by Russian authorities. They put them in a jail because of their principles to prohibited to take a weapon, because they don't join the army, and that's because they, really followed by authorities. And I would like to ask you about this group. Did they gain the followers among the local people since they came to Belize? And do they mix with the people outside of the group?
So for the Mennonites, they have about 12 different colonies, and as I explained in the video, there are two types. We have the traditionalists and we have the progressives. So in the traditionalists, you're not going to find no type of technology. There will not be cars. Most of them, they don't use any form of telephones. There are no televisions. And so they strictly live completely off the land. They don't consume things that are in, packaged. They make everything for themselves. And then there are the progressives. In Spanish Lookout, for example, they produce the poultry, the dairy, they're into, machinery, technology. They have some of the best technology in my country and very skilled people. But in some of the communities, it's primarily Mennonites. They do not, to a large extent, integrate as perhaps, immigrants or refugees from other parts of the world. But some of the communities, I would say in the last 10, 20 years, they're a lot more open. But this is not to say that they do not welcome Belizeans, because they provide employment. For example, in Spanish Lookout, they provide employment for all the buffer communities that are around, which are primarily made up of immigrants. And so they provide a lot of employment for people. Their school, they have their own school system. We're welcome to go to their schools. Growing up in my village where I grew up, we had a very, very tiny little colony, which maybe about 60 of them. And they had a school, they had a church. And for many, many years, I went to that church as a child growing up. And so they always welcomed us. They're never one to chase us away. But in terms of if you're gonna say you're gonna see them marrying Belizeans, a very small percentage. I have a couple friends who have married into the Mennonite community, and they're beautiful, welcoming people. But the level of integration, I don't think it's there yet, but they're contributing members of our society.
Thank you so much. My second question is to Guy Hawk. Guy Hawk, I would like to ask first, is it difficult to have a citizenship of South Korea for immigrants? And the second question to you is, you thought that you will avoid a question about the North Korea, but you won't. So does the refugees from North Korea has any privilege among the other refugees or immigrants?
Yeah, I'd like to go the second question first. For in South Korean constitutions law, the North Korean citizen also South Korean citizen by the law. So if the person who evacuated from the North Korea coming to our country, they will receive some money to stay, and they will get some housing and educational support by the government, and the regional government also support them person by person. So the refugee from the North Korean is the automatically citizen of my country, even though they were the military service. Yeah, they are all accept they can all receive the citizenship. And the first question, yes, I think I'm not familiar with. To be honest, I'm not familiar with the policy of the citizenship, because I'm South Korean citizen. So, but yeah, as I know, it is quite hard for immigrants without any how can I say, the investment immigrants or maybe the scholar academic kind of immigrants, except for them only for working visa or tourism visa. If they want to start them from that kind of status, it is very hard to get the South Korean citizenship. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues, for your wonderful presentations. And my colleague, Andrea, when she spoke about the Mayas, she reminded me of my history at university, the Mayas, the Incas, and the Aztecs. And you also spoke about the Creoles. Do you know specifically which part of West Africa do these Creole people come from? Because in my own country, Sierra Leone, our lingua franca is Creole. That's the language that is spoken by every Sierra Leonean, irrespective of the person's ethnic group. And also, in addition to that, how do you give citizenship to those who migrate to Belize, for example? Maybe how do you treat first or second generation of those who came? And so my colleague, John, should I wait when you answer, I go to Johnson like Melana did?
You can go ahead. You can go ahead and then I'll just answer.
Okay, and so my colleague Johnson Mayamba. The issue of refugees is very sensitive in my own region in West Africa. Like for example, in Sierra Leone, we have people who left some other countries in West Africa, like Guinea, Liberia. They are the sons and daughters of even third or fourth generation, but they still refer to them as foreigners in Sierra Leone. For example, someone's father had come to Sierra Leone even before 1945, and he was given birth in Sierra Leone. He's an African with a dark skin, and they still refer to him as a foreigner. Is that what is happening in Uganda? And so, Gayok, this issue of assimilation, how is South Korea helping to assimilate those who, your brothers who are coming from North Korea? I mean, how is the assimilation process going on? Thank you.
All right, so to answer your first question, so in our pie chart, I show the Garufinas and the Creoles. So the Creoles are people who are mixed with our British ancestry because we were colonized by the British. And so our Creole language is typically a broken form of English. If I should relate it to you, it sounds a lot like the Jamaican patois. And so when we speak our Creole, people would almost always think we're Jamaicans. I think it's maybe the closest thing that I can relate it to you. And so for the Garifuna, now they are the direct descendants of the West African slaves. And so as you know, the slaves were taken to that side of the world for logging, for sugar. And so the ones who are in my country, they migrated from this small island called St. Vincent, that's also in the Caribbean. And so they moved to Belize. And the second question was, the citizenship. And so, I think it depends who you ask. For some countries, it's a lot easier to gain citizenship in my country, but I know the typical thing is that you would have had to live at least 5 years in the country to be able to be granted citizenship. For some people, they find it very easy to do, and so you've had to be there working, or for others, there are people who sometimes get their citizenship after 1 year. So it varies from nationality to nationality.
Thank you, my brother. When it comes to Uganda's situation, yes, these refugees come, they are welcome, they are given free access to the country, but some of them over time have been incorporated as citizens of Uganda. One good example I can give is that currently, much as it's still a contentious issue, much as it's still a sensitive issue to discuss in Uganda, there are many voices that come out saying the current president is from Rwanda. He's a third generation, in his family is a third generation born, because as I mentioned earlier in the presentation of the first civil war that happened in Rwanda, many of the Rwandese came to Uganda and were given land and they settled in a particular area. And so over time, some of them have become Ugandans because Uganda allows dual citizenship. So some of them have Ugandan passports, but also still have passports from their own countries. The same happens with Kenyans, South Sudanese, and those from DRC. So it depends on what the person individual really wants, but over time, such people are incorporated as citizens of the country and are given passports, given national IDs, given the opportunity to also own property and land in the country and also settle. Some of them have not even gone back to their country. They just go back to visit, but they consider themselves more as Ugandans. Back home, they just have the blood connection.
Yes, thank you for your question. It is very sensitive issue in my country. So for North Korean people, the assimilation is, many people agree of the assimilate North Korean refugees from to in my country. So the government runs the kind of institution for to educate the people who are from South North Korea about democratic system or policy or the public orders, something like that. But yes, so many North Korean refugees are satisfied with that kind of system policy, the educational system, because they don't know about the payment or the market system or the public transportation like that. But for immigrants from other countries like China or Vietnam, as you can see, for them, the assimilation is kind of very problematic, I think, for some people, because there's a fundamental question: do we need to assimilate foreign immigrants to our country? So do we need to get rid of the stuff from the other countries? So that kind of question is very important for our society. So many people in my country are thinking about that. So they are on the way to make the policy. So in the past, we also accept the assimilation policy. So government give education for the refugees or the immigrants. But right now, things are changing, I think. Yeah, not assimilation, but for, how can I say it? Not just make them familiar with the Korean culture, that kind of level. Yeah.
We're having some really great questions here, and I want to extend now the Q&A to just 3 more questions. So please go ahead.
Great, thank you. My name is Sarah Mensch, and thank you all for your perspectives here to certainly shed some light, I think, on everyone's personal immigration situation. We have heard so many different approaches to immigration in various countries, and through all of your research, you've obviously shown us that. And I would just like to know, from your perspectives and everything that you've studied, what you think the best recipe for success is when handling immigration and the situations that you've observed. And that can be across economies, governments, and especially I'd love to hear culturally, because we've noticed Hungary's situation and the billboards that we saw compared to some other more welcoming situations that you've presented. So I'd love to hear more about that. And one side note question, especially for Andrea, everybody seems to be asking you questions, but with Belize's situation, and I've traveled to Belize, how does, in the cultural context of that, with immigrants from Spanish-speaking countries, and I know that Belizeans speak many different languages, but is there any sort of cultural, I guess, difficulty with a language difference as well?
Do I start? Okay, I can start. What was the first question? Oh, the recommendations. Honestly, I think the approach to the movement of people is so multifaceted and it's so difficult. And I don't think there is one approach or one answer. I think the approach to handling such an issue, I think it really has to do with the realities and the situation on the ground for each country. I don't think there is one answer to solving the migration crisis. For example, what may work in my country may not work in Uganda. What works in Korea may not work, in Belize. And so I don't think there is one solution. But what I believe is that if we prioritize the respect and the dignity of the movement of people, of immigrants, of asylum seekers, of refugees, I think if we prioritize, these things, I think that we cannot go wrong. And I think that if we find situations where we can see, because the truth is we're operating in a capitalist world. We want to benefit from something. If we're getting something, we're giving you something, we want to benefit from something. And so I think we have to find situations where, you know what, these people who are coming to my country, they're going to fill the need, they're going to do something, they're going to be taking up jobs, but we also have to be prepared to provide them with education services, with health services, because a lot of these people are coming from countries where they don't have these things, but they're also very proud people. They're not people looking for handouts. That's one of the things that I've learned about, the immigrants. They're hardworking people and they want to earn the things that we give them. And so they're not looking for pity. And so if we can find a way that, our countries or the two countries, whichever country we're absorbing, immigrants or refugees from, if we can find a way that we can both benefit from it, I think that would help. And in our situation, I don't think there's been any difficult communicating. For example, in my country, although English is our official language, we have the Creole, which is our native tongue, which is our dialect. And that kind of joins us all. We all speak it. It doesn't matter if when you come from Guatemala, 10 years later or 5 years later, you learn our Creole. And so 60% of our population speaks Spanish. And so I think it's one of the things that I've always loved about my country, just how much in harmony we live with each other. For example, when I left from my country and I went to Jamaica and I experienced just a cultural division in Jamaica, it was shocking to me because I was like, we don't have this where it come from. We all, loved each other. And so I don't think there's been, I'm not saying it's been perfect, but I don't think it's been, to the levels that we've seen, the discrimination, the segregation. No, not at all. Thank you.
In terms of the sub-Saharan Africa, I think one of the root causes of refugee surge is because of the instability in those countries where they're coming from. I think as a continent, we need to address the issue of political instability, address issues of having equal access to services for the citizens. But also when these people come, say, to the host countries like Uganda and others who move, especially to South Africa, these countries need to be more open in receiving these refugees. The government should take upon themselves to educate the masses that are hosting the refugees to be very accommodative and also receptive towards those that are seeking refuge. When it comes to the global call, I would say all nations need to come together in supporting those countries that are willing to open their doors to the refugees, because in reality, these countries really struggle in terms of resources. So if there is concerted effort in supporting refugees, say those, especially those that are in camps, it can be very helpful. But also when this aid comes, say, in those countries that are managing the refugees, I think there should be really proper accountability for the funds that are injected into humanitarian aid and facilitation of refugees in these host countries.
Let me add some shortly. In my slides, I give you the example of the Jonathan, the 6-year-old unregistered kid. But after the news released, the South Korean government fixed the policy to stay the unregistered kids to stay as an illegal, not an illegal, legal migrants. So this is the power of media. So we are in the Cronkite school, so I can say that. So the reporters or news media can always keep eye on the kind of immigrants issues. I can feel the US medias are always talking about the immigrants problem. Yeah, so that is the good role, a very nice role of the news reporters and our journalists. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hello. This question is probably more for you, Gayop. We've seen in your presentations that countries have different policies. For example, Belize and Uganda have a more progressive and open immigration policy, while Hungary and South Korea have a more hesitant, more conservative policy. My question for you would be, how do we get an ethnically homogenous country to see the value immigrants bring and have it shift the public perception away from, I guess, racist and stereotypical images of immigrants?
It's like a TOEFL listening test. So I can understand well. So can you repeat the question easily? Yeah. Sorry, my English is not that good. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. For in practical way, yeah. For the South Korea, the most homogeneity society, everyone on the street look like kind of Asians. Yeah, the black hair like that. Yeah.
Like you.
Yeah. For but that kind of society. But in practical way, the government always recognize that the immigrants is inevitable and kind of essential for the future, because we, as I said for the first at the slide, the labor is diminishing in my country because of the population is going down because of lack of the birth. So the government is kind of fixed the policy to welcoming the migrants. So and government kind of run the TV commercial to change the image of the public image of the immigrants to the public. So I think as time goes by, the South Korean people mind is changing from kind of racism or unfamiliarity to the welcoming or the openness to the foreigners or the immigrants. But I think again this is Cronkite School, so when the crime is which is committed by the immigrants or especially committed by the illegal migrants, then the stereotype is changing too strongly. So they are all dangerous people, so we cannot accept the kind of migrants from other countries. That kind of opinion is very exaggerating, magnified. So I think the media also trying to just report as it is, not magnifying or the exaggerating the kind of stereotype for the public. Yeah, I think that people are very easy to listen to the news or the YouTubers or social media things. So the journalists must keep the eye, how can I say, make the balance. They try to make the balance about this issue. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And moving on to our last question for today, please go ahead.
I'll try to make this brief, but good afternoon. Thank you for your presentations. A lot of you focused on policy and the social response to immigration and refugee resettlement, but how can, in your perspectives, businesses in the private sector step up and play a bigger role in supporting refugees and immigrants?
So for South Korean, there are some examples. So the business sector. So Samsung is a Korean company, so they support the kind of for the immigrants who are struggling with the digital poverty. So they give the kind of digital device, kind of the laptops or the tablet PC to the refugees or the immigrants who are struggling in a economic crisis. So that is the main, I think, the example for your question. Is it right? Yeah.
Okay. I think on my end, I think what the business world or the corporate world or the industries can do is that a lot of them use migrant labor because they can take advantage of these people, because we can pay them low wages, because we can overwork them. And so I think there ought to be just greater reform in terms of even, the hiring practices of these these businesses, hire, immigrants and, pay them well, see that, they get their documents so that they can reside legally, compensate them, ensure that they get an insurance so that they can take care of their families. And so I think this is just the best way that we can, do to support them. Of course, hire them, for jobs. There's always opportunities for work. And so give them jobs. There are some companies that are very, anti-immigrant, the sentiment, and sometimes it's because of the society that we live in, but, create opportunities for immigrants, but also, make sure that we compensate them, make sure that we don't take advantage of them. We have, large corporations that hold these people's passports so that they cannot do anything. They live in just squalor and poverty. They're working for pennies. And so this is the best way we can do, pay them well, compensate them just like any other worker.
When you asked, I was reflecting on my country's situation and how they are responding to a refugee crisis. Just to add on what Andrea has said, yes, we have these companies that are employing the refugees in my country, but then they exploit them. Why? Because they know they are desperate, they know they are in need of such jobs to sustain themselves. But then when it comes to supporting, now those is for the refugees that choose to move beyond staying in camps. But when it comes to those that are still in camps, most of these businesses only come out when it's time for them to advertise themselves. They hop onto, say, a campaign, they throw here and there freebies to the refugees, like t-shirts, a few amenities for them to help themselves, but then after a campaign is done, they disappear. So I think beyond the campaigns, beyond coming in just once in a while, it should be a consistent assistance towards the refugees that need help when they come and seek refuge in our countries. Thank you.
And just to add just a little bit on to, what Johnson has said, I think some of the best ways is to support some of these organizations that are helping, immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers. There are many small grassroots, there are many global, organizations that are doing a lot to promote the welfare of these people and to promote just their smooth, and safe and orderly movement. And so, businesses can support these organizations, whether, it's with funds to get people across safely, whether, it's services or in kind, but there's a lot of ways I think that, the business world can assist.
Well, that will conclude our Q&A. I want to thank everyone for joining us today here live and also online. Let's please give a round of applause, and thanks again for being here.